I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. What are we looking at today, Rob?
Commie propaganda.
Oh, goodness gracious. I love commie propaganda.
It's Commie Propaganda Week here on the podcast.
Wham.
I feel like we should have... What would be a good theme song for Commie Propaganda Week?
I believe The East is Red.
Is that a song?
It's very much a song. It was the most played song in the 1970s because that was all they played in China.
Yeah. No, I remember once being in a cab in China and listening to... There was some radio, report on one of the party conferences. And apparently someone hadn't really done their homework and they were looking for just good martial music. And they'd actually put on the Imperial March theme from Star Wars in front of the Communist Party meeting. I feel like we could maybe put that in here, but I think you're right. The East is Red would probably work better.
We might be violating copyright in that case. But if we used The East is Red, we would be totally fine because there is no copyright in socialist China.
It can't be. Yeah. They can't do that. We're talking about specifically a story called Yan'an Seeds by the Chinese writer Hua Tong, translated by Mark Carlton Hill. There's a lot of this kind of stuff that comes out of China in the Maoist era being 1949 to 76.
When you say comes out of China during that era, what you actually
mean
is...
it stays in China. Yeah.
It came out of China and it stayed
in
there.
China. Yeah, that's probably a good way to put it. It's not like they were exporting masses of this stuff to the eager readers of the West.
To be fair, the Mao's Little Red Book, which is even more propagandistic than this crap.
Right.
And it is crap. Let's just go ahead and...
We're going to talk about that in a second. It's crap from one perspective, not from another perspective.
So it's crap from my perspective, which is the right perspective.
It's crap from the perspective of an elitist snob.
Exactly.
Like
Thank
Lee.
you.
Yeah.
As opposed to you, the commie, the
man of the people, I think you mean to say.
I think that's exactly what I meant to say. I just pronounce it commie.
Okay. I'm glad we have this clarification.
So Mao wrote his Little Red Book, and that book was one of the most widely disseminated books in the history of mankind. It's up there with the Bible, or it was in the 1970s. And
for obvious reasons.
I guess the obvious reason that you're mentioning is the fact that it is the one thing that you can read without getting in trouble during the 1960s and 1970s. So we're talking about the Cultural Revolution here. This goes from 1966 to 1976, roughly. I mean, different people date it in different ways. But during that period, China succumbed to essentially a kind of communist civil war where the Communist Party was divided against itself. And one of the things that happened is oftentimes intellectuals particularly were
purged.
They were purged. They were, heavily criticized. And when we say criticized, we mean dunce caps placed on them, heavy weights placed around their necks, made to kneel for long periods. Lao She, who we've talked about previously, he committed suicide after being criticized. So this was not your grandma talking... This was not your grandma spanking you.
No. And in fact, one of the events which is going to form the sort of the narrative spine to the story was when they effectively, I think even Mao started to realize that the college students, especially, that he'd whipped up into a fervor with the notion that all the old guard needed to be basically taught a lesson because they'd grown stilted in their ways and had become sort of capitalist roaders, they call them. So you needed the young people to teach the old people how to be good communists again. But if you whip a whole bunch of college students up into that kind of frenzy, it's a little hard to get them back in the bottle, you know?
It's interesting how many parallels there are to, if you think about France or the United States in this period, the kind of youthful rebellion that comes up with the baby boomers. These kids that are being whipped into a frenzy are essentially baby boomers. They're the kids who were born immediately after the Chinese Civil War ended in 1949, and they are doing similar things. But the thing is, unlike in the U.S., where they were kind of anti-establishment, here Mao is supporting them, and he gives them the support of the state, and they destroy China.
Of course, it should be borne in mind here that by the Cultural Revolution, Mao was in a bit of disrepute with the party because of the disaster of the Great Leap Forward in the 50s. And so a lot of this was Mao seeking to reestablish his claim on a party that was starting to go, The revolution thing was great. Thank you for that. But our economy sucks, and it would be great if maybe we had, some money or something. That'd be nice. To which Mao, of course, says, I don't think so. All we need is
more
revolutionary spirit. Now, what I was going to mention a second ago, though, that the movement that forms the spine of this story is where all of these whipped up to our fervor college students get sent out to the countryside into distant places in the country. The nominal idea being these are going to be the people that learn from the peasants and the miners and the ordinary folk, and they're going to bring that back with them, and it's a really peculiar movement. I heard a talk once here about the spread of Maoism in the 60s globally. American scholars, French scholars are finding this stuff fascinating. And if you've studied Chinese history, you're like, what in the world, man?
Yeah.
But the idea is an interesting one because Mao's one of the very first, or one of maybe the only real socialist thinkers to go, actually, the common people, the farmer, not the farmer who's extremely well educated and writes really well, but just the farmer, has something to say about art and philosophy, And that's a seductive idea because, if you have any kind of social conscience at all and you study things like literature and philosophy, you have those moments where you're like, does this even matter? Like, no one even knows what I'm talking about. Wouldn't it be better if I was just out serving the people, So let's go ahead and talk about the story itself.
Yeah, let's do that. The plot, if you could summarize it, how would you summarize it, Rob?
It's a pretty simple plot. Actually, and we'll talk about this in a second. It's a very simple plot, but it's more complex than a lot of the other stories written at this time.
It's of this genre of bad, crappy stories. It's maybe one of the better pieces of crap.
So the idea is this. There's a guy named Secretary Zheng who is reading his newspaper one day and realizes that he reads this news story of a young female cadre member who saves a fellow cadre member from being crushed by a rock, but she herself is badly injured. And he realizes, oh my goodness, her name is Ji Yanfeng, who's the daughter of my old comrade in arms, Ji Zhengming. So I have to go see her. And he goes to see her and, reminisces as he's on his way to see her about all the heroic things that he has done with his comrade in the past. And
the story is mostly backstory.
And the seeds thing comes in as a metaphor. We'll talk about that in a second. But he goes to see Ji Yanfeng in the hospital, and she's all better. And there's a guy there who's been an old farmer who's sort of been a part of taking care of her while she's one of the youth that's been sent out to the countryside, bolstering her spirit, bringing her into the revolutionary, fold. And the three of them sort of talk about their various experiences in the revolution, as it were, and compare their life in communism to that of a seed. So you're planted in the soil of the people, you're tended by the people, and you grow up into this revolutionary plant. So that's the idea. And that's basically the story. And the reason I say it's a more complex plot than usual is because I've read quite a few others, like, of this genre.
Fiction.
And a lot more happens. It's very event-based. The characters are fairly bland. They're there to illustrate. It's almost like Commedia dell'arte. They're there to illustrate some aspect of Mao's thought or socialist thought. They don't really have any interiority. This one's entirely first person. There's some reminiscence. It's not all good reminiscence. There's some tough stuff in there. It also has one of the only really accurate complaints about the down to the countryside thing that I've seen, which this girl in the hospital talks about first arriving at this village, and her complaint, when she first got there, she was having trouble fitting in, and her complaint is, look, I have all this great education. Why is it being wasted out here? And the reason that intrigues me is because a lot of the other stories of this genre don't usually give voice to that realistic and reasonable a complaint. Most people like this who are complaining are usually depicted as idiots or lazy or greedy. This is a very courageous, wonderful heroine who's expressing this. So it's an interesting thing that you don't see it done a lot.
Yeah, despite all that, it's still kind of boring as a story.
But actually, this is the question I really wanted to start with, which is, so I think both of us will admit that the story, frankly, is crap. Taken from the perspective of, say, other amazing works of Chinese literature, of which we've talked, a lot on this podcast. What makes it crap?
So I would say, for me, and this is what I wrote when I was reading the story, conflict, ? That's what makes it crap. The fact that there is no conflict. And here's the problem. In socialist fiction, two problems. You can't have a conflict because if
you can. It just has to be against non-socialist elements.
No. So in socialist fiction, it's very difficult to have a conflict because the whole point of socialist realism in a country that's already a socialist paradise is, how can you have a conflict in a paradise? You can't. There is no conflict, and so it's just boring. All of the conflicts come earlier, and that's why so much of the story is just backstory, which any person who knows about writing and how to do writing is, people always overdo the backstory. But this story is worse than most.
Says the guy who likes Proust, which is one long backstory.
Whatever. The backstory is the front story there.
Right, got it, whatever.
But there's not really kind of any redeeming qualities to this backstory, but that's the only way you can have this story, is because without it, there would be no conflict, and therefore there would be no story. Another thing, you mentioned this, we use big words like interiority. That just means this is a person who we feel like we could have a beer with.
And that's it.
That's it. You can use that as the definition of interiority, is I feel like I could have a beer with this person and talk about them and find them interesting.
But a person like this with no interiority is the person you'd have a beer with, and that would be all you did. Like, no more conversation.
It's just like talking to a wall.
And you would only have a beer with them if they bought you the beer. Then you might actually think about it. But otherwise, yeah. No, it's interesting because a lot of these stories are either crap or just boring because the characters are enlisted solely for illustrating a point. Now, what's interesting here...
And I should say, that's not just socialism that does that. Lots of people who write stories for political points do so without being concerned about the nature of the story itself.
Now, what's interesting about this is that there is a lot of fiction in Europe in the 19th century that uses social types. Like, this is the landlord. This is the person who cleans the stairs. This is, like, they're defined by this sort of social niche. But someone like, say, Balzac would use that character and sort of play with and against the type.
I'm going to have to say this. I think Balzac is crap too.
I love Balzac. Okay. Oh my goodness, we're gonna have to fight after this because I think Balzac's brilliant.
I'm glad I brought my
I think
kung fu magic.
I think Father Goriot is one of the great novels of the 19th century. But anyway, but what makes Balzac, one of the things that makes Balzac work is that even in this type, even if you have just a dweller in a specific arrondissement in Paris, you read that, and it's like picking up a story from a genre. Like, so science fiction, you go into it expecting certain things to happen. If you see a character from this certain arrondissement in Paris, and you're a French reader, you go, I know what this person's going to do. And so Balzac plays around with that. Now they do something they're not supposed to do if they're that character, et cetera, et cetera. Most socialist fiction, they're just the character. That's it. They're the type. The bold heroine in this story, Tian Feng, even is described exactly like the young women in propaganda posters, like with the two little pigtails and ruddy-cheeked and muscular and ready to go.
She's also very. You use the word muscular. She's very masculine.
Yeah,
I've read some interpretations of the Cultural Revolution as this kind of feminist paradise in some ways, even though you do have all of these other horrible things happening. It allows the culture, Chinese culture during the Cultural Revolution allowed women to do things just like men, and it had the same expectations of women as it did of men, and women were able to, I mean, it seems very similar to a lot of the stuff that is going around in the media today about kind of women and the Me Too movement and how feminism should be. And I'm not pronouncing on that, but I will say that one of the interesting things I thought about this story is how masculine she is, because she runs and grabs a peasant and like saves his life. It's quite heroic, but it's very masculine. She's very muscular.
Yeah, which isn't necessary. I mean, I know what you're getting at. It's not necessarily though only men can be muscular, but there is this sense in this era that in order for the socialist movement to proceed, most of these old distinctions between men and women have to be done away with, because you don't have women doing their thing in the socialist movement and men doing their thing. Everybody's participating,
Right.
and they're doing whatever needs to be done. And this is ultimately the old farmer's advice to Jian Feng, who's the heroine of the story, when he tells her, he gives this long illustration of a seed, right? And then essentially says, you're here not because you're smart, but because you're filling a need in our village. And that's enough for you. That's what you're doing for the movement. It doesn't matter what you've learned. It only matters what you can be used to do, you know.
I wanted to turn to that notion of seed. That plays a very important role.
Well, and
symbolically.
let me jump in right before we talk about that and just point out that I'm not aware. And we'll talk about this maybe a little more later, but there's not a lot of other stories I've read from this period that are structured. The whole thing is structured on a metaphor. By the time you get into the late 60s, which I'm assuming is when this is written.
The story, I believe, was written in 71.
Okay, so it was definitely after the Down to the Countryside movement had started.
It was, just to mention this, it was turned into a manga, a cartoon in 75.
And probably sucked.
It kind of would be interesting to talk
It might
about.
be better that way. I don't know. But, you know, I was reading one of my old professors from Nankai University wrote a book on modern and contemporary Chinese poetry. And, of course, nobody studies stuff from 49 to 76 because, like the story, it's mostly crap. But sort of with a resigned sigh, he was like, yes, okay, fine, most of it's crap. But here's the thing. You know, you can only write totally socialist realist fiction so long. And then there comes a point when you have to start trying to clue people into the fact that there's still stuff to be done. We're not already there. We have to keep going. And so you have to start thinking of ways to get people to think beyond what they're just looking at right in front of them. And that means thinking of new, maybe making use of techniques like figuration or symbolism or things like that, which they were not doing before, right?
It was very direct.
Very direct. This is not direct. I mean, it is direct. For us, it's direct. But if you're reading this in the late 60s or the early 70s, I should say, the whole thing is structured on a metaphor. That's not a common thing. That's done. This is, I don't know what to say, it's brand new. But you're getting people to think beyond just what the words on the page are saying directly to them.
And let's talk about that metaphor. So
Yes.
the metaphor is the seed. Yan'an, we haven't mentioned where that is. Can you tell me about Yan'an?
So the Yan'an reference is to Mao's Long March, where he and the communists fled west and north from the nationalists in 1934, they were about to be wiped out. And so they marched about 9,000 kilometers from Jiangxi province all the way up to Yan'an in Shanxi, through some of the worst terrain China has. Something like not even 5% made it to the end of the march. It was some crazy figure like that. Like they started off with like 100,000, ended up with like 1,000 or something.
Yeah, but that small percentage who did make it,
Yes.
they became the elite of China's Communist Party for the next 15 years.
And let's put
then
it this way.
they became the rulers of the country for the next 30
And
after that.
it's also what makes Mao's legacy so tricky to parse, because with Mao, there sort of is a part A and a part B. You have the Mao who marches 9,000 kilometers with everybody else on foot all the way up to Shanxi province and sets up collective farms, most of which worked, incidentally. I mean, you're not collectivizing an entire country, so maybe that's why. But they were dealing with very poor peasants and did manage to mobilize them into collective units that worked very well, that everyone got fed. And so if the story had ended there, we would have a very different idea. But the Mao that takes over in 49 is a very different figure.
Well, Mao is constantly going back and forth between his like idealistic, actually doing good things form to his I'm a tyrant, I'm a totalitarianist.
And one way to look at that,
let me see if I can murder more people than anybody in the 20th century.
Well, let's put it in a different frame of reference, though, because if your entire early political career is shaped by an event like this, you don't move on from that. Like, this is it. This is what politics is. It's struggle, it's war, it's revolution. And if things are settling down and getting easy, you become suspicious, because that's not politics. Real politics is when you're out getting stuff done, and this is not it. We can't just sit in conferences and talk about numbers. That's not politics, you know.
And we can see this kind of stuff coming out in the story.
Yes, absolutely.
Because there is this need constantly for Mao and for his revolution to have revolution. You can't have things sitting you can't sit around in a room and have a conference, and that's not government for him.
No.
And that's not government in the story. There always has to be something bad happening, but because of the nature of the socialist paradise, it has to have always been in the past. What's interesting is the kind of symbol of the seed.
Yes.
So Yan'an is the town where the Long March ended.
Yes, thank you.
And this girl was born. She comes out of Yan'an.
She doesn't come out of the city of Yan'an. Her father fought in the communist, the Civil War, and she was born in the Huaihai campaign, which was 46 to 48.
Right.
Right at the tail end of the Civil War. It's one of the greatest victories the communists won against the Kuomintang.
And her father went to that campaign.
But her mother was stuck behind and was encircled by the nationalists.
And her father was given a set of seeds that had personally been cultivated by Mao.
Chairman Mao.
And so that plays in. She is literally of Mao's seed. And there's one thing that you always see when you look at socialist art that I always find interesting. There's oftentimes you'll have a family who's just hanging out, and there will be a mother and a father and children, but the father is normally like shoved to the background by Mao or by Zhou Enlai. I've seen photos where Hua Guofeng. Do you know who Hua Guofeng is? So Hua Guofeng is actually like pushing. He's visiting this Tibetan family, and he's like blocking the father. So he becomes the father of the nation. But it's also this weird kind of like, hey, what are you doing here? But the real father, is always happy. And so there's this sense that Mao's seed, which you claim I'm a Freudian.
You are.
But there's something very sexual about seeds. I'm just going to put it out there. But Mao's seed is what causes the heroine to germinate.
Because, and this is why I say the story is a great deal more complex than many others. Now, granted, the metaphor is heavy-handed, but here's the different layers of the metaphor. So literally, her father, the heroine's father, is given some seeds by Chairman Mao. Right, so he carries those seeds with him. They use these seeds in their little work group to grow pumpkins so that they can eat. And they take those seeds with them to the next place they go, and they're not able to grow pumpkins there, and so they drop the seeds on the ground. Those seeds germinate into pumpkins, and it's those pumpkins that the heroine's mother eats to stay alive after she has the baby. Okay, so that's the literal seed, and the heroine, Jianfeng, takes her father's seeds that he's given her, keeps them in a book of Chairman Mao's quotations, and carries them with her wherever she goes. So that's a literal seed. But of course, the figurative seed is Mao and the people, especially the people, are the soil. The sent to the countryside people are planted in this soil, and they grow into true cadres. So over and over again, this metaphor gets brought up and sort of recast, turned around, seen in a different way.
But in another way, I mean, Yan'an is impregnating. But on another level, there is the hint that Mao is somehow, metaphorically or otherwise, the father of Jianfeng, which Yanfeng's name literally means the wind of Yan'an.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or the spirit of Yan'an.
Yeah, the spirit of Yan'an. And so there's these many layers of this one image, and I say it's heavy-handed because in the story they explain precisely how to read the image, which is, in good symbolism you don't do that, you just let people sort of think about it.
But socialism doesn't allow individuals to just think about it.
It's got to be pedagogical. It's got to be direct, and here's what you need to know. But for all of that, if we step back and say, okay, compared to Zhang Ailing or Lu Xun, or I really like Gao Xingjian. A lot of people don't, but I do. The story's awful, but compared to other stories in this genre, it's quite good. In terms of what it's doing with the heavy-handed, melodramatic elements that it has to use.
So I think that's a good place to start wrapping it up. Robs rates this as crap, but some of the best crap that was produced. Some of the best crap
you're going to read
from this period.
You said there's no conflict, which is technically true, except that the heroine does go through an internal struggle, and starts out by resenting having to go work with the peasants because what a bunch of losers.
Again, that's all backstory.
I know. But the conflict can't happen in the present. It can't happen in the past.
You need conflict in the present to have a story.
Okay, fine. But so Lee's right in the sense that the conflict is resolved, but to say that there's just no conflict at all is silly.
Fair enough.
And so there is a lot of backstory, but again, that is kind of unique. I don't see that a lot.
Rob reads a lot of this bad crap.
It is interesting.
I'd say
it's 27 years of literature and art. That's more than a fifth of the entire 20th century in China. To simply leapfrog it is unwise because a lot of the people that we would interact with in China now, whether because they chose to or had to, read this stuff growing up.
Let me ask you, do you think in 100 years this will still be relevant?
It depends entirely on what you're studying. If you're looking at the representative great works, aesthetically speaking, of Chinese literature, probably not.
Can you point to a something in contemporary Chinese literature where this kind of literature is still having influence?
But I think we're going to get off track, though. In terms of people looking back and going, I want to write like Hua Tong. No. But a lot of the people growing up in the 80s or 70s and 80s, the only entertainment they had was this stuff.
So we've talked some about the Xingun movement, and they are all responding to this. And we both agree that there is some artistic value in the Xingun movement, even if we disagree about how that really works out. We both agree that the Xingun movement, the root-seeking movement, has artistic value.
Yeah, I like the way you say some artistic value, as though like, it's also mostly crap, I think a lot of it's really fast.
This has very little artistic value. I think we can both agree on that.
I would agree. But
even a commie like you.
But we do get, this is why I think it's such an interesting story, is because the reason we tend to overlook this stuff, and therefore not frankly understand what a lot of Chinese people in the 70s and 80s were thinking and studying, is that we tend to look at all of the 20th century in China through these sort of great works of literature lens, unless it's scans like Proust in China, it's not really worth thinking about. And that's true. If your goal is simply to understand canonical texts, that is true. If your goal is to have some lens to understand and appreciate how the culture has developed, you have to read stuff like this.
Fair enough.
Because the vast majority of people in the 20th century in China are not reading avant-garde and experimental Chinese fiction. Is not happening.
I think that's a good place to end it. I mean, we can think about this not necessarily as a great work of literature, but as an artifact of a time that was very important for China's development.
I would agree, and I think that it's an interesting read to see how China got to where it is.
I'm good with that. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.